This is the Comics Alternative, episode 240, a publisher spotlight on Koyama Press. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Andy and I are going to take a look at the spring releases from Koyama Press. But before we get into that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by their great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, you can take advantage of bundles where you can buy multiple comics from the same publisher at a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And this month they have bundles at 45 to 50% off from DC, Marvel, and Valiant. So you can check those out.
That's right. Every month is Great Discounts Month at Discount Comic Book Service. Discount is in their name. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, we have quite a lot to discuss on this episode. This is a publisher spotlight on Koyama Press and their spring 2017 releases. But before we get into the books, we should share with our listeners a variety of tweets that we've gotten over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, let's hear those.
Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
And in fact, I noticed an increase in the reactions we've been getting on Twitter since we've been doing a lot of what I would call high-profile interviews, or at least interviews with high-profile creators. Now, people are all the time liking and retweeting what we put up on Twitter, all the episodes, every kind of episode that we put out, interviews and otherwise. But we've been getting more comments and based on the interviews. Mm-hmm. And this started a couple of weeks ago when we put up the Matt Kent interview. And in fact, one of our listeners, Jay Loving, responded damn good in reaction to our Kent interview. And then around that same time, a longtime listener, Lindsay Gertzlauer, responded, "Hey, two guys with PhDs, really enjoyed the Matt Kent interview." And then when we put up about a week later the Jeff Lemire interview, Jay Loving again shouted out to us, another score for the two guys with PhDs. And then Joshua Wilson responded with, great interview, really enjoyed the discussion, only sad there was no mention of Rye. Will it ever return? And then when we put up our recent interview with Cullen Bunn and Brian Hurt, someone by the name of Anton responded, just listening to these two guys makes me happy. The back and forth, the collaboration, Cullen and Brian are the team to work with. Now, Anton was surely talking about the team of Cullen and Brian, but hey, it was a substantive response to that episode. And then once again, John Loving responded in reaction to the Cullen Bunn, Brian Hurt interview. Holy balls. These guys are on a roll with great interviews.
Is that us? Are we these guys on a roll, or
yes.
Is it? Okay, good.
Yes. So now, Anton was responding, I think, referring to Cullen and Brian, but Jay was responding to us that you and I are on a roll. And we elicited holy balls as a reaction.
Yeah, I usually do that when after we're done recording. I usually just let out a holy balls. Yeah, the one who, going back to the one who mentioned that he was sad or disappointed that we didn't mention Rye when we talked to Matt Kent. I realized that after we got off the air with Matt that I didn't bring up Rye in the 4001 AD crossover that he did, and I had every intention to do that. So my apologies. I do agree. I like that series, and I do hope it does come back. But that would be, I think then that would mean Matt Kent would be doing 12 out of the 8 Valiant series. They would publish, I think, 8 issues a month or 9 issues a month or so. So, and already 2 or 3 of those are by Matt. So,
well, this is what we had discussed in one form or another when we did the interview with Kent and then Lemire, is that those guys, and I think you could say the same of Cullen Bunn and Brian Hurt, they do so much that there's no way that we could get even just a passing reference to everything that they've done, and we would like to ask them about in one interview. So, yeah, I mean, we'd like to discuss everything with them, but we just don't have the time. But it is interesting that we are getting more of these kind of responses on Twitter because of the interviews. And lately we have been doing these interviews with higher profile creators, but we do interviews with first-time creators that may not get near as much of attention, but are nonetheless, I think, very much worth listening to. And in fact, pretty soon we're going to have an interview with Dave Chisholm on his book, Instrumental, that's going to be coming out soon from Z2 Comics. And then the other day, Gwen and I did an interview with the creators behind a new second book, Shattered Warrior, Sharon Shin and Molly Knox Ostertag. And people may not know those people's names, Chisholm, Shin, and Ostertag. But nonetheless, they're interviews that we love doing, and talking with first-time creators or younger, let's say, first starting off creators is kind of a different dynamic, right? I don't feel like we have to get everything in as we do with, let's say, people like Jeff Lemire or Matt Kent. Mm-hmm. But we do appreciate your reactions, whether it be on Twitter, Facebook, email, Instagram, or whatever. But just let us know that you listen, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for the encouragement.
Okay, so you want to get into this week's episode, the Koyama Press Spotlight.
Yes.
Yes. And, our listeners may be wondering, hey, didn't you already do a Koyama Press Spotlight? Well, yes, we did a couple of years ago, and we had a great time doing it. But we thought that there's so many good books coming out this spring from Koyama that instead of choosing one or two to review on different episodes, we would just go all out and do another Koyama Press Spotlight. And all of these books, and there's 6 of them, Eleanor Davis's You and a Bike and a Road, Keiler Roberts' Sunburning, Jesse Jacobs' Crawl Space, Eric Kostiak Williams's Condo Heartbreak Disco, Ben Sears' Volcano Trash, and then finally, So Pretty, Very Rotten, Comics and Essays on Lolita Fashion and Cute Culture by Jane Mai and Anne Gwen. They all debuted this past weekend at TCAF. So as we're recording this, TCAF is just wrapping up.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So this is TCAF weekend. And I think with publishers like Koyama that operate on a seasonal basis rather than, say, putting out something every month, I think doing these spotlights makes a lot of sense.
Yes, exactly. And there are a lot of presses that do this, and a number of them Canadian. In fact, later this year, I think in the fall, you and I are talking about doing another Conundrum Press spotlight, and they're very similar, I think, to Koyama in their publishing strategy. Now, even though we did do a Koyama Press spotlight a couple of years ago, one of the things we didn't do is to get to talk with the publisher behind Koyama Press, Annie Koyama. I had the pleasure of talking with her about a week or so before TCAF, and let's listen to that interview now, and it'll set a context with the books that we're about to discuss, especially as it pertains to the press as a whole.
Yeah, let's listen to that.
I have the pleasure of talking with Annie Koyama. She is the founder and publisher of Koyama Press. Annie, thank you for talking with me for the Comics Alternative.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Andy and I are looking forward to reading the spring releases from Koyama. And what I would like for you to do is to, I guess, introduce Koyama to our listeners. Now, for those who've been listening to the Comics Alternative for a while, they should know about Koyama Press because we've discussed a number of your books in the past. We've even done a Koyama Spotlight a couple of years ago. But we thought it was time to do another, and we thought it'd be great this time around to get you on the show to where you can set a broader context of the press.
Sure. Believe it or not, I've been around for 10 years now. I'm a small press publisher in Toronto, Ontario. It's where the TCAF show happens every May in 2 weeks, so that's pretty exciting. I started out wanting to be an art book publisher, but what happened in Toronto is the two big places you could sell art books closed that very same year. Very sad. So just sort of serendipitously, I sort of went sideways and ended up doing comics, alternative comics. I hadn't read this kind of comics in, really a long time. I grew up with comics, but not this kind of comics. It was entering a whole new world for me, really, really exciting. It still is exciting because those of us who do what I do in our little corner of comics, it's not very lucrative. So you basically have to be doing it for love. But over the 10 years now, I have published over 100 titles. I've done art projects with a lot of artists. I do keep my fingers in the fine art world as well and do that kind of project with artists because there are a few places now to sell art books unless perhaps you have, fancy $300 Taschen books. There's not a big market for it anymore and, fewer places to actually sell them. So I basically have gone off and I started doing kids comics a few years ago. I felt that there was a lot of wonderful kids picture books, but maybe not. I want comics for people who will grow up and then read Jesse Jacobs or Michael DeForge and not have it be a stretch. So that helped fill the, no art book void. And I'm still doing it today, still standing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Michael DeForge. Now, he's someone who has published quite a bit through Koyama. How many creators do you have like DeForge who you consider part of, if not your stable, then creators that you can rely on who will always come back to you, who are always welcome?
Well, nobody is unwelcome, but I'm at the stage now where I have overhead. I have Ed Canerva, who's wonderful. He does production and marketing and many other things for me because when you're in a very small office with very little staff, you end up doing more jobs and wearing far more hats than what your business card says. I have two part-timers as well, Helen Koyama and Daniel Nishio now. So I have mouths to feed. I now have to consider, unlike the early years when I was just running on my own funds, whether, I have to be able to pay off my printing costs. I have to figure in that kind of thing when I take a book on. Having said that, I probably will still take a risk on someone I know will not sell a ton of copies. It's not ever my prime motivation, but I can't ignore it anymore. I do have to pay attention to numbers now.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do you find the artists who ultimately publish with Koyama? Do they come to you? Do you and Ed seek them out?
I do that on my own. This company is basically based on the stuff we do is it is my own taste, for better or for worse. I have had people sent to me in the early years. Michael DeForge was very helpful and, took me around to beguiling and introduced me to a lot of artists, old and new that I ought to have known should I have been paying attention all those years, but I wasn't. So he gave me sort of a crash course. Because of Michael, he introduced me to people like Jeanette Lapalme, Patrick Kyle, Chris Kuzma, the Wawizank crew. I have worked with all three of them as Wawizank, and if I am working with all three of them with their own books as well. So there were that kind of referrals. The rest of them, many people, I found them on Tumblr in the middle of the night because I don't sleep a lot. It's true. The only advantage of being an insomniac is you have more time to look at stuff when it's quiet. I see a lot of stuff online. I've met people at shows, but because when you're small and you can only do, say, 8 to 10 to 12 books a year, and you have repeat books with artists you're already working with, and then you throw in the mix children's stuff, there's a lot of stuff I would like to do, but I can't do. I also want to devote quite a bit of attention to each book and each artist. I can't do that if I do more than, say, 12 or 13 books, even with Ed's help. So it's not the way I prefer to work. And therefore, those spots fill up pretty quick.
Mm. So do you publish on the average about 10 to 13 books a year?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that with the spring release that you're actually going to debut these titles at TCAF in another couple of weeks. There are 6 titles from some creators that I know that our listeners are familiar with, like Eleanor Davis, and then others that they may not be familiar with. For instance, we've talked briefly with Keiler Roberts on the show before when I was at SPX last year, in fact. But I don't think we've ever discussed any of her comics on the show. So this is going to be a first.
She's fantastic. I cannot wait for more people to know about her. She, as a person, is an admirable, inspiring person. As a mom, as a person who lives with bipolar, disease, she knows depression well, and she still can have a sense of humor about it and get through life, be a loving mom and partner and a fantastic artist, a teacher to people. She's a wonderful person. I wish everyone would read her book because you'll get a lot of laughs. But what I love most about her is she just will say anything. She'll say that stuff that people are all thinking, and no one has the balls to say it, but she'll say it. And she'll put it out there, and it's even more hilarious because of that. She's not afraid to tell the truth. I love her.
Right. And there's some creators with new works coming out, for instance, like Jesse Jacobs, that I think we've discussed in passing on the show before, especially when his comics have appeared in anthologies.
Yes.
But we haven't really talked about him in a substantive way. So you have these 6 books coming out, debuting in a couple of weeks at TCAF, and you will have another, 5 or 6 debuting later this year at SPX?
Correct.
And is that the way that it works with Koyama Press, that you debut your books at TCAF and then SPX and then release them?
Well, I've tried to time it to a show because I've always liked to bring the artists with me as much as I can afford. It's getting a little bit harder with the border situation, and the low Canadian dollar is pretty crappy. So it does, actually, on paper, it makes no sense for me ever to go back to the U.S., which kills me. But as you can see, I don't only work with Canadians. And so Keiler and Ben Sears and Eleanor, of course, and Jane Mai. They're all part of the spring group of artists. And then in the fall, I guess this will be announced soon, but I've got wonderful Noel Freebert, Hannah K. Lee, Sophia Foster Domino. You're getting a scoop here.
Wow. This is great.
So those are all U.S. artists. And I want them to come to shows and meet their fans. And some of them have quite a good following. Some of them are less known, but I hope that won't be for long once their book comes out.
Well, what other shows do you tend to frequent for the kind of audience that is drawn to Koyama books? Not to be crass, but it sort of comes down to money because partly our dollar's so crappy. Mm-hmm. But I am repped at the Cake Show in Chicago, which is a fantastic show. I don't actually go there myself now because it just kills any book sales that we would have. But I like to be at that show. I used to do the cab show all the time, but right now it's pretty tough. I walk over the border and I lose, more than a third of the dollar just walking over the border. So wow. You can do the math and see why it's difficult for me to come. So I have gone back to do more local shows. There's a wonderful zine show in Toronto called Zine Dream, and a couple book fairs. We do those. I sort of take it year by year. In Canada, I'm fortunate enough that unlike a lot of people in the U.S., we are able to apply for and hopefully sometimes get grants to travel people. And so this year we were successful in getting a grant to take Ed and Helen to Tokyo in November for the Kaigai Manga Festival. And there's a smaller festival that same week called Comic Arts Tokyo, I believe. That's correct. So they'll be going to that. So, that kind of thing doesn't happen every year, but boy, oh boy, wouldn't it be great if it did? Yeah. And Koyama has published manga in the past.
No, not really. The only book that was brought to me that I did not go out seeking the rights for, Annie, she, and Graham Colbain's brought me the What is Obscenity book. So that was a reprint that we put our own stamp on. We added some new material to, and that book is atypical in that way. It's not that I'm not a manga fan. I just don't know much about it, so I'm pretty stupid that way, and I don't want to. When you are a publisher with the learning curve of never knowing anything about publishing, and have to go from 0 to 150 very quickly, it's probably wise not to venture into every single genre of comics and without knowing much about them. So manga is one thing that I have sort of stayed away from because I just can't. An A-type personality needs to know sort of everything about it. I already don't know everything about the alternative comics, history that is a little bit embarrassing. But so I actually have stayed away from it. It's no diss on manga fans or anything. It's just I don't know anything, so it's not for me to be putting that stuff out.
Yeah. Well, and I asked that because I remember last year we did discuss your What is Obscenity book, which on our manga episode, and we love that. And I get the sense that May and Gwen's So Pretty, Very Rotten, which is going to be debuting soon, that's definitely informed by manga sensibilities.
Absolutely. And to be honest, other people that I work with, you can definitely see that influence as well. I'm just saying for myself personally, I don't know much about it. I haven't read it, so I remain pretty ignorant around it. What I like about this is I was curious about Lolita culture. Again, I didn't know much about it, but meeting Jane Mai has, opened my eyes to a few things. And I was always a fan of Anne's work. People know her as Psycho Inc. And so it was pretty interesting to work with them. What is interesting also about that book is I tend not to want to work with people, a writer and an artist. I prefer, for better or for worse, to have the artist also write the book. So having two people, working on one book, that's a departure for Koyama also.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but now that I think back on some of your previous titles, that definitely makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, so you've been doing this for 10 years. What are a couple of the big things that you've learned along the way?
How many hours do you have? The biggest thing it took me a long time to figure out was the minute you can get a large distributor, if you are prepared to do the work and conform to their schedules and work that far ahead, make the kind of books that they're going to want. All those things were hard for me because I grew up with floppy comics, pamphlets. I love that format, but distributors won't take them. So I had to move to books with spines. It's not that I have anything against book with spines, but I guess, I'm 12 years old and I don't like to be told what to do. So prying that away from my fingers was hard. That was really hard. Working at least a year to, 2 years ahead, that was hard. I have, there are prolific people like Michael who can do, 4 books a year if he wants to. And then there's people who take 5 years to do a book. There's, it's difficult and it's different with everyone that you work with. So that was a big learning curve. That's probably the biggest.
Yeah. What about aesthetically? Has your taste in comics changed since you've become a publisher?
I don't think so. I guess the advantage for myself is not having been schooled in or was reading, these comics when all the rest of you were. It was like, being born 10 years ago, eating up everything you could see about it. And then, when you've done it for 10 years, you can see certain sort of schools and styles that keep coming back, and people who are informed by Adventure Time or, I do work with people who are very, very informed by superhero stuff. You can just see that stuff more clearly, whereas at first it was like, little kid in a candy store for me. I didn't know all this stuff was out there because I grew up with Archie and Superman and Richie Rich and Pogo. So, yeah, I don't think it's changed. I think that there's as much different stuff out there now. I feel happy that what are called art comics are being a little bit more accepted, day by day. It's always going to be a hard sell and a big risk for a publisher to take on to do that kind of book. But those books ought to be out there, in my opinion. So I hope there will still be people who are prepared to take the financial hit in putting them out there. Mm.
And, of course, the best way for listeners to learn more about Koyama Press, in addition to listening to this brief interview, is to visit your website, which is koyamapress.com. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they'll find there, and actually this is one of my favorite parts of your site, is the Kick-Ass Annie Gallery. So, and for our listeners who haven't seen this is, I guess, a variety of different artists who have drawn you in any number of ways. How did this start?
Okay, so it's not really me. It's my avatar, although after 10 years, I guess they've glommed together because I certainly do have the characteristics that logo avatar has. A shout out, a huge thank you to Aaron Layton, one of the first artists I ever worked with, who quickly created that logo so that we could throw a company name and a logo on a book before, when I sold my car and sent him and his 2 partners off to Japan with the very first book that Koyama ever did. I loved it so much that I actually commissioned a few people initially to do their version of it, and then I posted them, and then it went nuts. People were contacting me, several times a week. People were just sending me them randomly. Later on, their kids were doing them, and they would just send me, look, my kid did your logo. There are now over 300, maybe even up to 400 versions. We just got too busy and had to stop putting them on the site, so I'm way, way behind. But you name a diverse creator out there, and they probably have done it.
Wow. So maybe a future book devoted to Annie avatars?
I don't think so. I'm asked that all the time, and the reason is I feel very uncomfortable selling any branded stuff. I do work very hard to brand my company because I want to draw attention to the company so that people will then discover mostly emerging artists. It's very hard when you're working mostly with emerging artists to get press, to get eyes on their books, way harder than, being able to say Jaime Hernandez. Everybody knows Jaime. Nobody knows Gigi. They will know Gigi next year, but it's just very hard. So I'm going to say no. The other thing is Sophie's Choice. When you have 400, like how can I can't do a book of 400, even if someone convinced me to. And then how do I edit out? Oh, it's too upsetting. I did, hurt too many hurt feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what you're putting out now is definitely enough, and it's worth checking out. And it's something that drives us for a second time to do a publisher spotlight devoted to Koyama Press. Annie, I want to thank you for taking the time and introducing our audience to Koyama Press in a broader sense. Now, Andy and I are going to talk about these new titles, but you have definitely helped us to set a context.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Derek.
So there you go, my brief conversation with Annie Koyama. I hope she had a great time at TCAF this past weekend, and I appreciated talking with her for this Spotlight episode.
Yeah, it was nice of her to give us the time, and everything I've heard about TCAF so far from friends and creators that I follow who were there make it sound like it was a great weekend. I'd love to get up to that.
Yeah,
that show.
I do too. Maybe next year.
Yep.
Yes. And again, thanks to Annie Koyama. She is a very gracious person. I've met her a couple of times at SPX, and she's very friendly, very welcoming, and easy to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump into the books that they're coming out with now that just debuted this weekend. And we're going to start with You and a Bike and a Road by Eleanor Davis.
Yeah, so this is an autobiographical work. It's basically Eleanor Davis's journal as she undertakes this massive bicycling trip from her parents' home in Tucson, Arizona, to her home in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. In Athens, Georgia.
Yeah, and basically what she goes through along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And this is, I think this is a little different from what at least I'm used to reading when it comes to Eleanor Davis's work, in that it is more autobiographical. Mm-hmm. Now, back in September of last year, you and I discussed Libby's Dad, which was a Big Planet retrofit mm-hmm. book, kind of a short pamphlet comic. And then she also published, I think a couple of years ago, How to Be Happy, which is a collection of stories that came out through Fantagraphics. Mm-hmm. But those were not autobiographic, at least discernibly so, that I could tell. And she's also done a couple of books for Toon Books, for younger readers. So do you know if she's done any memoir or autobiography work before?
I was just trying to look for that because I feel like she has, and now I can't remember.
Mm. And the way that you put it a second ago, this is like her notebook on her travels. Mm-hmm. Much of the feel of this book does have a notebook tone, down to the point that a lot of the art looks like it's sketched in pencil, that if you rub your finger across the image, you'll smear it.
Yeah.
So it retains that
true.
look.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And these are some of the images and observations that apparently she made as she was biking across the states that she was going through. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we'll get information about her actual journey. So about how far it was from where she started one day and where she planned on ending up at the end of that day, or where she was able to pitch a tent and what that might have meant. Other times she'll doodle, as in a notebook, mm-hmm. observations like when she gets to Texas, one of the things that struck me was the different flowers that she drew, which are things that I'm, very familiar with living here. And so I could identify, even though this is not in color, I could identify the kind of things that she was drawing here, or the kind of birds that may populate a particular region. Sometimes what she documents are her interactions with various people, and not only the people in the various towns, for the most part smaller towns that she's passing through, but also fellow bicyclists.
Right. And as one of the things I was struck by with this book is, as a journal, as opposed to say a narrative that is kind of formed from the beginning, or with a case of autobiography, kind of formed and contained in retrospect as having as having a defined beginning, middle, and end. Because this is a journal that she's doing as she goes along the road, it has this sense of immediacy to it, but also a sense that whatever themes or motifs or kind of ideas running through the book are going to emerge organically and not in any kind of planned form.
Right.
And so one of the ones that struck me the most was how much issues of border patrol and illegal immigration come up when she's traveling, especially through Texas, or through, I guess, New Mexico and then Texas, and she's riding pretty close to the Mexican border. She seems to be, even though she may be in the middle of nowhere, is under surveillance by helicopters that fly in low to see if she's if she's got darker skin, to be blunt.
And she makes that observation. Yeah. She says that if I look different, then I'd probably be stopped.
Right. And so the idea that emerges as a theme or an idea that runs through at least the first half or so of this book. Once she gets out of Texas, it seems to go away. Was kind of surprising too.
Right. And in fact, one passage that really stands out to me in light of what you just said, and this takes place in the first quarter, definitely the first third of the book. And this is soon after she gets into Texas. So she's going through farmland in West Texas, and she tells us that she's on the road when this little black car goes by very quickly. And then following that car is a Border Patrol truck. And then what happens after that is that this car that passed her, the black one, ends up in what looks like a reservoir. And the guy got out. He's not hurt. And he's walking in the middle of this. And you've got people from the Border Patrol on both sides of the reservoir that's trying to get him to where they can pull him out. And this takes place over several pages. I think it's one of the longest passages in the book, especially as it deals with Border Patrol. And I don't know, that's just one that really stuck with me after I read it.
Yeah, because and it seems to stick with her too, because a little later on when she gets some downtime, she gets on her phone and tries to Google to see if there was any news of that accident or news of what happened to the person that she saw in the canal.
Yeah. And, another thing about the Border Patrol references is that she doesn't demonize the officers who work for the Border Patrol, which I kind of expect it in a way. I mean, not made out to be evil, so to speak, but at least to show them in a less than positive light. And I would say that for the most part, her depiction of the Border Patrol is more or less neutral. I mean, she's basically making observations here. And there are times where people who are with law enforcement who are near the border, when she encounters those people, they're polite, they're friendly, they're doing what they need to do. And so, I mean, I don't think she packs anything in this story that is heavy-handed.
No. And there's even a point, I think, where she stops and gets some water from one of the border patrol officers, and they have a nice exchange. But I do think that, you know, and this may be what I'm putting into it, but despite this neutrality, the surveillance seems so pervasive, whether it's helicopters or, you know, border patrol agents on the road or a blimp, that does come across as kind of scary and insidious.
Exactly. Yeah. But, and I think that is very effective in that she doesn't overtly make those observations. She just, or comment on those observations. She just mentions what she saw and leaves it to the reader to make their own inferences. And so it reminds me in many ways of what Twain does with Huckleberry Finn. Now, you know, Eleanor Davis is not a naive narrator here, just as, you know, like Huck is in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You know, but like Huck, she makes observations. She really doesn't comment or make any kind of value judgment for the most part on what she sees. But I think that makes the critique even more impactful to the reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. So she does. She goes for 2 months. This journal covers of this this biking trip, and I think one of the net results of reading this book is it made me feel, out of shape, weak. These stories of, riding her bike for, 50 plus miles a day. The strain on her knees, especially, all that is really, really pretty visceral as the book goes along. She does a really good job of communicating just what the physical pain is like, and yet, part of the purpose of this trip for her is therapeutic.
Yeah, and she tells us this fairly early on. Yeah. She's seeing this as a way to deal with some depression she's experiencing. Yeah. So I take it that you're not a biker.
I have a bike. I probably need somebody to look at it to make sure it's still rideable. I used to bike a lot, but mainly, when I was a kid and stuff. Or at Purdue, I biked to school every day. Since we lived in Lafayette, this is not going to mean anything to anybody who's never been to Lafayette. And riding to West Lafayette, that hill that you have to go up to get to the university killed me every day.
Yeah. You got your
and I would always,
though.
Yeah. And I'd always pass our department chair, Dr. Adler, as he was walking to work, because he walked every day. And I'd have to yell out, "On your right," as I went past him. Yeah. Or I would just slow down, and I was like, I don't want to have to. He was on my committee. Yeah. I don't want to have to confront him right now.
Yeah. Well, you're right. She does point out, Eleanor Davis does point out some of the, especially at the beginning, the physical wear and tear that she experiences because her legs aren't used to this. She has a knee problem. 1 or 2 times she stops off at a grocery store and gets frozen peas or green beans, and puts on her knee in order to take care of it. She goes 1 or 2 times along her route to an acupuncturist to help with these pains. And so, I really like that she makes this as realistic as possible. In fact, she even inspired me, like you, I have a bike, although I've been into older adulthood trying for the most part to stay on the bike occasionally, but it had been at least a year since I last biked diligently. And I have to tell you, after reading You and a Bike in a Road, Eleanor Davis inspired me. So a couple days ago, I got out my bike, I inflated the tires, I cleaned it off. And so for the past 2 or 3 days, I've been biking. So, and
good for you.
And then the first day I wanted to see how far I could go. So I went 15 miles. And I was thinking as I came back, it's like, that's 15 miles. So I probably went a quarter of the distance on average that Eleanor Davis went on the days that she would bike.
Right.
Because she would go anywhere from, let's say, 50 to 70 miles.
Yeah.
But the one thing, though, that I didn't see in this book, and, she talks about the wear and tear of what it meant for her physically, but the potential dangers of her, especially being a woman out on the road. I would think that man or woman on a bike by yourself, there are all sorts of potential hazards, the most prominent of which is careless drivers, right? People who, if they're not paying attention is one thing, but I've even been biking before where people have thrown things at me. And so I can imagine biking over a 2-3 month period where there's going to be a lot of that. But she really didn't experience that. Although there is one passage that I thought was funny that she addresses the potential for violence. At one point, and we don't have page numbers, so I can't give you a page number where I'm looking here, but this is on day 14 that takes place on March 29th. And she talks about how someone stops along the side and says, "Are you traveling alone?" And Eleanor Davis responds, "Oh no, I'm with my husband." And then right under that, there's this fantasy scene where she tells us what she means by "I'm traveling with my husband," which is a knife, right? So, and she fantasizes that this big guy is coming up to her saying, "Hey doll, are you all alone?" And she starts stabbing him in the eye saying, "Meet my husband."
Right. And so I think we're to assume that she's carrying this knife with her for protection.
Yeah.
So some of those dangers on the road, I think, are handled a little bit more subtly, that the way she picks, for example, camping spots that aren't visible from the road,
right,
or finds places to hide her bike while she camps, all seem to be pointing to concerns about that kind of safety, but without being too specific about it. And it seems like, one of the things that I found really interesting here too is, whether or not she did have any kind of instances that she didn't tell about, and I think she would, that where her safety was threatened. Just how helpful people are and how much of a kind of support structure there already is in place for people who want to do this sort of thing. She talks about, for example, this website, I think, called Warm Shower, where it gives you, lets you know where people who volunteered to allow someone to use their shower when they're doing a bike trip like that, or how many people also just kind of out of the goodness of their hearts stop and help her.
Right.
And whenever I see, it makes me think, whenever I see people on bikes, because I drive a lot on the interstate, that, maybe I should be nicer. I mean, I'm not mean to them. I don't throw things at them or flip them off when I go by. But if I see somebody now that's clearly doing a big bike tour, I might try to be a little helpful, like some of the people are in this book.
Yeah, a lot of people, and a lot of these nice people are in Texas that she encounters. So
yeah, I don't So it didn't inspire me to want to get on a bike, I don't think, but it inspired me to want to be nice to people who are on bikes.
Well, good. So see, Eleanor Davis had an effect on both of us beyond, what listeners would normally expect. Right.
Right.
So that's good. I really enjoyed this book. Again, we don't have page numbers, so I don't know how many pages it is. I mean, it's one of the thicker books that we're discussing this week, but it's a relatively quick read.
Yeah. I was surprised how quickly it went, but also how engaging it was throughout. I think it's, I like Davis's work. Like you said, it's a bit of a departure. It does seem like the kind of thing that Koyama Press does well, which when you have a creator like Davis who's who's otherwise publishing through Fantagraphics and so on, that a project like this seems to fit with the sort of thing that Koyama does, even with relatively high profile in the alternative comics world cartoonists like Eleanor Davis.
And in fact, let me use what you just said as a segue to the next title, and that is Keiler Roberts' Sunburning, because even though I don't know if Keiler's work has been out there as noticeable as Eleanor Davis's has. I still think that she is a big name in alternative comics, but like as with Eleanor Davis, this book, Sunburning, is the first time she's published with Koyama.
Right.
Now, listeners of the podcast may remember that at SPX last year, I actually talked briefly with Keiler Roberts, and she was really friendly, talked a little bit about powdered milk, and then Gwen and I even discussed, I think, what was it, issue 14 maybe? I can't remember. She was up for, and I think she got, if I remember correctly, an Ignatz Award that year. And so we discussed it on that September show last year. But she's probably best known for her self-published mini comic, Powdered Milk. She has collected a number of those issues of Powdered Milk into book form. I know that I read Miseryland, which included issues 9 through 14. But, if you want to read Powdered Milk, if you've never read it before, it really is interesting. You can go to her website, KeilerRoberts.com, and that's KeilerRoberts.com. And so you can find her mini comics, Powdered Milk, that is still up there. And it really is interesting looking at Sunburning that we're discussing this week, and then going back to look at some of her very first Powdered Milk comics, because you can see that early on she was looking for a style, not only in terms of the art, but also how to write about her experiences. And these are diary comics, right?
Right.
Right. So it's a special kind of autobiographical comic in that, especially what we have in Sunburning, they're moments of her life. Although one of the things that she does that's very different from, I think, what most diarist comics do is that she doesn't, especially in her later comics, early on she did, kind of divide or distinguish the entries by title or date or anything like that. And so in reading through Sunburning, you could go from one moment in her life to the next, sometimes apparently on the same page. But I think that it's clear enough that these are different moments that she's noting, again, journal or diary-like. And so I don't know if you necessarily need the segue or the division, the indicators that this happened on this day or this happened at another moment in my life. And it gives it a kind of fluidity reading through Sunburning.
Right. But if there is a kind of narrative that runs through this, it seems to be a lot of it has to do with her relationship with her daughter.
Right.
And but also how her autobiographical comics are affecting that. And I found that to be some of the more interesting stuff. She also deals with her depression and some of the treatment that she goes through for it. But it seems like the driving kind of through line is, and this comes up a lot in Powdered Milk anyway, is her relationship with her daughter, but here specifically, her cartooning as well.
Yeah. And, even from the beginning, because when she first started her mini comic Powdered Milk, she had not had her daughter yet.
Right.
But in the early days, she had just gotten pregnant. So when she did bring up the fact in her own comics that she was a creator, she would use her husband as kind of a sounding board, right? So some of the comics of the early Powdered Milk, and even the later ones, and you find this in Sunburning, are her talking to her husband about some of the cartoons that she's doing, getting a reaction from him, or him reacting to something that she's done, even if she hasn't asked for any kind of input. But you're right that with these later comics, and again, a great example would be some of the things that we find in Sunburning, is the relationship that not only her to her daughter as mother and daughter, but also her as cartoonist and what that means to her relationship to her daughter. Because one of my favorite sections of the book, and I'm trying to find it now, is when she imagines at one point about what is the effect of including her daughter in her comics? In other words, she asks herself, when she gets older, is that going to affect her daughter one way or the other? And in other words, when she gets older, might she be a little more self-conscious about the fact that her friends are saying, hey, I was reading some of your mother's early comics and you're really funny in that, and she may react to that negatively. But then she fantasizes, what if she didn't include her daughter in her comics, and she imagines later in life her older teenage daughter saying, Mom, why didn't you write about me during those times?
Right. And then she even draws her older daughter in this fantasy future in some really kind of futuristic dress as well.
Yeah, some kind of teenage thing going on there. Yeah.
And the daughter says it would have been fine. We've all desensitized ourselves to embarrassment through sexting. So it does seem like Keiler rationalizes including her daughter in the comics just because, this upcoming generation of kids is not going to know anything about privacy anyway. Is everything of their lives is just going to be out there on social media or whatever, and broadcast 24/7. So it doesn't really matter. But there is that earlier. I mean that passage really struck me. But there is the earlier passage where she does address the fact that her daughter's cousin has read Miseryland and read Miseryland to the daughter. And so, the daughter responds, there's the part where I say, don't hurt me, mommy, ha ha ha. And the mom and Keiler says, I'm glad you think that's funny because that is a pretty dark moment in Miseryland. And then she imagines it would feel terrible if some kid told you something about your own family that you hadn't known. And then one kid's talking to the daughter saying, your mom's bipolar. What's that? I don't know, but it's really bad. I also want her to know without any memory of not knowing, she says as well. So she does explain to her daughter what it means to be bipolar.
Yeah. See, this is an occasion where I really wish we had page numbers because I could. I've been flipping through trying to find that passage, but at the same time I'm listening to you, so my attention is divided here. But yeah, I mean, I think that Keiler Roberts' comics, both in this book and then just in Powdered Milk as a whole, are at their best when when she confronts what's going on in her real life, especially as it relates to her family, and in this case specifically the daughter. But she doesn't sugarcoat anything. In other words, she points out even those moments where she thinks that she may not be the best of mothers. in the way that she's treating her daughter or even her husband. And so we get those moments as well. And I appreciate that, because then she seems a much more human figure instead of just, let me tell you, through these autobiographic comics, the kind of person I am, and I want you to see me as a nice person or a good person. Mm-hmm. She doesn't come off as bad in any way, but we do get to see the more human side of her, because, there are times with my kids that I've done things that I don't necessarily like, but I reacted in a certain way and I'm not proud of. And, she doesn't pull back from representing those moments.
Right. I just wonder, as Roberts' comics progress, will they continue to be this kind of self-referential, where we're going to see more and more the impact. What's going to happen, for example, when her daughter is, gets to be of the age where she's reading comics and she reads these comics, and what's going to happen, she speculates on what it's going to be like when she's a teenager, but what's really going to happen when she's a teenager. I'm not sure how I would have reacted. We're recording this on Mother's Day too. I'm not sure how I would have reacted if my mother made wrote a book about my childhood. I know how she would react if I wrote a book about my childhood. So I don't know what that life would be like for a kid growing up to have that kind of level of scrutiny that being in, the spotlight, I guess, within the alternative comics world means. Mm-hmm. And, when I was at CXC, Keiler and her husband, Scott, and her daughter were there. So, you were, I guess, all the stars of her comics were right there. So, and I don't know if that happens often with their conference appearances or convention appearances, or if that was unique to CXC or maybe to local ones in Chicago where she's from.
I don't know. And I can't remember at SPX last year if she had other people there at her table. Honestly, I don't remember. What I do remember, though, is that she did a special SPX edition of Powdered Milk at the time, the latest issue, number 15, that had a different cover. It was the same interior, but it was a different cover. And on the cover it said, Keiler Roberts, 2016 Ignatz nominee, Outstanding Series, Table H8. So she had those there at the table.
That's nice.
Yeah, but I'd had, I guess, that earlier version, that her regular edition that she came out with. And, I'm wondering, this is, to my knowledge, the first time she has published outside of self-publishing with Koyama. And I'm wondering if we're in for more of this. If not through Koyama, then maybe other publishers, maybe even bigger ones like Fantagraphics or Drawn in Quarterly, that will begin publishing her. And then if that's the case, what that might mean for her style of comics art. Right. Yeah. Or
because I think go ahead.
No, I was going to say, or, along with that, if she'll do something other than diary comics eventually. Right.
Because, that ties into what I was going to say, because, her, I'd be interested in seeing somebody coming to Sunburning without having read Powdered Milk. Because it does seem, it feels like with her, and this is true for, any diary comics, the real impact of them is cumulative, right? Mm-hmm. You follow them long enough and you see the threads emerge. It's kind of what I was saying with with Eleanor Davis's book a little bit, but in an even bigger way, because you're following 4 years and there's no end point. There's no closure to the narrative. So, her work pays off in a major way because because it's cumulative like this.
Right.
Right. And so probably every issue of Powdered Milk is somebody's first issue of Powdered Milk, so they have to enter at some point. But there is a real benefit to following that series for a long period of time and then getting to something like Sunburning and having all this background information.
Yes. And, that's an interesting point that you made, wondering what it would be like for someone coming to Keiler Roberts' comics for the first time, picking up Sunburning, and what their experience would be like. Because, not only would they not have been following her work to see, the various strains that are woven throughout her various Powdered Milk stories, but along with that, it gets back to something that I mentioned earlier, how she structures these various segments of the diary. And I'm thinking as, by contrast, another comics diarist, Gabrielle Bell, what she will do is that she will give almost every occasion kind of a title or a date of one of her entries. And so you can clearly distinguish one entry from the next. So this is a moment of her life. Now this is another moment of her life. Now this is a third moment. But Roberts doesn't do this. And so I can imagine someone coming to this for the first time and being a little confused, not necessarily in a negative way, but needing to, so to speak, get their sea legs in reading Keiler Roberts. Because I think there is a particular rhythm of reading her work that helps to understand it and appreciate it better. And I don't think it takes much time to get into that rhythm, but once you find out what she's doing and how she's doing it, then you can really get into an appreciative reading mode with this. But, you and I, we've read a number of her comics in the past, and so picking up Sunburning, we were familiar with her style. But a first-timer, it'd be interesting to talk to him or her.
Right.
Yeah, I really like this. Another thing I'm wondering about Sunburning, and I was looking just now at the copyright page, I don't see anything about this, not even in the back with the acknowledgments. I wonder if these were earlier issues. I don't think they are earlier issues of Powdered Milk. I don't recall these. And if they were, I would think that information would be somewhere in the copyright page.
Right. I would have thought that too. I didn't see anything.
So I'm guessing this is entirely brand new work.
Yep. And our friend Brian Cremens is thanked in the back.
Another Chicagoland person.
Yeah, she did the cover for Brian's book as we talked about it.
That's right. So we were talking about Keiler Roberts and Eleanor Davis as two creators that had not previously been published by Koyama Press. Now we're going to turn to the work of someone who has largely been published by Koyama Press, and that's Jesse Jacobs. His new book, Crawl Space. In fact, it's the only hardcover of the 6 that we're discussing on this episode. And Are you familiar with any of his books? I know he's been excerpted in, like Best American Comics and other anthologies, but have you read any of his other works?
No, that's my primary experience with him is from those excerpts.
Yeah. Now, he had a book in 2012 from Koyama Press called By This Shall You Know Him, and I think that's how I came to know him first. That was a Koyama Press book. And then a couple years later, Safari Honeymoon came out in 2014. Although before that, he was published, Even the Giants, through Ad House. And that was in 2011. But again, most of his books have come out through Koyama, and this is just the latest. And, rightly or wrongly, I have always mentally placed Jesse Jacobs in the same realm as Michael DeForge.
That makes some sense. I mean, I think he's within even within a larger school,
right,
that I would include Michael DeForge. I would include some of the stuff that Box Brown does, not everything
right.
he does.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
And so I do think that I think when we look back on this time period in comics history, there's probably going to be a bunch of different trends in schools that we see emerge. But I think that's one of them.
Yeah, Ron Roger is another who would fit into that.
Sure. And and even now I'm blanking on Brandon Graham.
Oh yeah, some of that stuff. Although one of the things, though, that strikes me different from Jacobs' work from, let's say, the others, especially DeForge, is that, and see if this makes sense to you, I've always seen Jesse Jacobs as more of a symmetrical artist.
Yeah.
Not that all of his illustrations have this kind of symmetry, right, where one half reflects the other, but it just seems that his comic art tends to have more of a visual balance than that of, let's say, Box Brown, Michael DeForge, and the others that we've mentioned. And I think we definitely see that kind of symmetry in places, and at times with a vengeance, in Crawl Space.
Yeah. It's interesting that you use the term symmetry, because where I saw the Box Brown connection is in what I would call his geometry.
Okay.
Some of the stuff that we read when we did the Retrofit Big Planet show from Brown reminded me that we see that in Crawl Space too, that there are clearly defined shapes, if you will. It doesn't have the looseness that, say, Michael DeForge's art has. Right. Where it's just kind of an imaginative line that kind of runs wild in these different ways. Whereas Jesse Jacobs' work is certainly imaginative, but as we see with the characters in this book, they all have pretty geometrically consistent heads, and the creatures that live in this parallel universe that much of the story takes place in are all different, clearly defined shapes.
Right. Now, the first two books that we discussed on this episode were autobiographical in one form or another. Now, this and the following two are works of outright fiction. So basically what we have in this book, Crawl Space, what the story is it's made up primarily of two characters. There's Daisy and Jean-Claude. And in Daisy's basement, there is a washer and dryer, and we don't really learn this at the very beginning, so it's a little confusing at first. But once we're into the first several pages or so, we learn that there's something about Daisy's washing machine, her family's washing machine, that when you enter it, you go into this different dimension. Now, what is this dimension? How do you define or describe it? It's very difficult. And even in the book, the characters are at a loss as to what exactly this is. But the distinguishing differences between, I guess in this book, what you could call the real world and that of this other dimensional washing machine world is color. And so the everyday mundane world is represented in black and white. But whenever there is an entry into this washing machine world, this other dimension, or when aspects of this world invade the mundane world, it's represented in these very bright, stark colors, like colors of the rainbow, basically the yellow, the green, the blue, the purple, the magenta, the red. And the way that Jacobs combines these colors into various shapes can be disorienting as a reader. And it could even be, this dimension is disorienting to these characters. But even as readers, it catches you off guard at times.
Right. So this other dimension that Daisy and Jean-Claude go into is is disorienting. It's also addictive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a lot of the narrative of this, because for all of its kind of experimentation and its visual surrealism and so on, it's a pretty straightforward narrative. It's
Mm-hmm.
Basically, two kids find this other dimension. They let too many other kids find out about it, and they ruin it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just basically, kids ruin stuff. How many stories are about like kids take a good thing too far,
Right.
And so there's some themes too here about friendship. I think one of the more interesting aspects of this book for me was how Daisy and Jean Claude's friendship changes over the course of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't go in the directions I expected it to, and doesn't go in the directions that those kind of conventional young adult stories would normally go.
Right.
So while it does have this underlying narrative that may seem familiar in its basis, it's not. It doesn't necessarily go in the direction one expects.
Yeah. It's interesting because the first time we're introduced to these characters as characters, because at first I didn't know that we had two coherent figures, Daisy and Jean Claude, until I got into the second quarter of the book. But after they get out of their washing and drying machine for the first time, then Daisy says to Jean Claude, "Now don't tell anybody else about this." And her reasoning is that she is a relatively new student to the community and she's an outsider, and they'll think of her as even weirder if Jean Claude says, "Hey, over at her house, if you go into the washing machine, there's this other dimension." But of course, what does Jean Claude do? The next day, she tells friends about this. And you're right. That's where the kids start coming in and ruining a good thing. But there's also a downside to the dimension itself. So outside of the fact that some of the kids abuse this dimension and don't treat it with respect, there is, as you pointed out, something addictive about this realm that Daisy almost literally loses herself in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Daisy even explains early on that you have to go into this dimension with the right mindset. You have to be positive. You have to be a good and pure person. And if you go into it with the wrong motivation, it can be dangerous. It can be even more dangerous than just in its addictive qualities. And it can leak out too into the real world, right, or into our dimension, I guess.
Yeah. There's, along with that, there's one passage in this book that I think is, for me, quite telling, not only in terms of the thematics of what we've been discussing, but also as a possible way to approach Jesse Jacobs' comics, and not just Crawl Space, but I think a lot of his other books. Again, we don't have page numbers. I think there's only one book that we're discussing this week from Koyama that has a page number, and that is So Pretty, Very Rotten. But this one is about, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through, and it's maybe the second time that Daisy takes Jean Claude into the washing machine. And on one page, Daisy is talking to Jean Claude, and they're surrounded by different colors and shapes. And this is how the dialogue reads. Daisy says, "Collect a wide variety of these shapes, then group them into small piles, distribute the pigments proportionately, arrange them in order according to where they belong in the color spectrum, assemble the pieces into complex structures, allow yourself to dissolve into the patterns." And that's not only what goes on in this story, but I think that's also a good way for at least to describe the way that I approach Jesse Jacobs' comics, because he does use colors sometimes, now maybe always, but definitely patterns that you can group together, or that he as the artist groups together in ways that start to make some sense, but the sense that they make basically is dependent upon your absorption into what he's doing. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I found that one page there kind of a key part of the text.
That's good that you point that out. Because it also shows a kind of meta level of attention to this book where Daisy is showing to the creative process, and we can imagine that's also a creative process that Jacobs goes through. So we're not to think about these arrangements of shapes and colors as being completely random. There are patterns in these shapes, and those patterns aren't accidental.
Right.
Okay.
And along with that, there's something about what you just said that strikes me as quite spiritual, and maybe not spiritual on the level of a Ron Reger, as we were discussing a few weeks ago, but there is something about the way that Jacobs draws and the kind of stories he tells that seems to have this transcendent quality to it.
Right. Yeah.
At least thematically transcended.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that also helps kind of explain, and I don't want to give away the ending, but explain some of the directions that this comic goes. And it ties into that idea that in order to enter this world, you have to have the right attitude, you have to have the right mindset, almost in the sense that to appreciate a Jesse Jacobs comic, you can't go into it and say, oh, this doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before, I'm not interested in this, and slam it shut and throw it away, or not look at it or not get it. You have to go into it and with an open mind to accept the experience you're going to have.
Yes. Yeah, and what you just said makes me think that of all the creators that we're discussing on this episode, this Koyama Spotlight, it strikes me that Jesse Jacobs is the one that would probably be least accessible to, again, for lack of a better way of describing this, kind of a common comics reader, knowing that there's no such thing as a, common, typical comics reader. But I think that most people who read comics on a regular basis, especially aren't familiar with Jesse Jacobs, would pick up something like Crawl Space or, let's say, Safari Honeymoon and go, what? And then not even give it an opportunity because it doesn't follow the kind of conventions, not only in terms of storytelling, but maybe especially in terms of the art that we're used to in comics.
Yeah, I really appreciate it when a creator doing something experimental like this gives the reader a kind of code for accessing it.
Yes.
And I think when you bring up Ron Reger Jr., I think that may get at what some of my frustration was with what Parsifal saw, is that I don't feel like I have decoded how to read some of the stuff yet, and it's not necessary that a creator offer that, but I think that it's helpful for Jacobs, who's creating unique comics to begin with, to do that. And when I teach stuff, when I teach comics or even teach literature, I often try to start with a question like, how does the creator, the writer, the artist teach us how to read their work? Like the opening panels of Persepolis, for example, that section called The Veil, is there to teach us to read Persepolis.
Right.
We get a sense of Satrapi's art style, of how we're supposed to be looking at her character, and how comparing her character to others, what the distance is between a Western reader's experience and the experiences being conveyed in the book, and so on. All that is packed into just a few panels at the beginning of that, so that's a great teaching moment to kind of unpack a whole narrative based on what the creator gives us in order to teach us how to read their work. And so I appreciate that Jacobs does this. And as I think you were pointing to earlier, it isn't just helpful for reading this particular book, Crawl Space. It's helpful for reading his other work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really do like Jesse Jacobs' work. And, I hope to see more of his stuff, whether it's through Koyama or some other publisher in the not too distant future.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to the fourth title we wanted to discuss as part of the spring lineup of Koyama Press, and this is Condo Heartbreak Disco. This is by Eric Kostiuk Williams. And now, I don't know about you, Andy, but the first time I was introduced to Williams was late last year when you and I got a copy of a Retrofit Big Planet book, Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit. He has a thing with titles.
Yeah.
And I had not heard of him before. Had you?
No. And I really like Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit, and I think that got nominated for an Eisner.
I think it might have. We'd have to look to see, but that when you said that didn't sound unfamiliar to me.
Yeah, let me look that up. Because when I saw that, I thought that is not a book that was something that came up for me. It was nominated for Best Single Issue in one shot. That was not something that came up for me as one that I thought would immediately come to mind as getting a nomination, but I do like it. And what I like about it, what I liked about Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit is the autobiographical stuff that was in it. Williams talking about, for example, how he connected with people through message boards for, I think it was Fathom comics that he was reading. Mm-hmm. I thought that story was really effective and moving. Condo Heartbreak Disco, however, is not autobiographical, at least not overtly on the surface.
Yeah, not that we can tell. And also, it's different from Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit in that it's a little longer and it is in black and white, whereas Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit was in color. So this is kind of a it's a strange story. It's a fantastical story. And I guess if I had to put my finger on what this is about gentrification, thematically speaking, right? And what one could do to resist that.
If one can resist it, I think is a question that is left hanging at the end.
Yes. And this is the story of, and I think I'm getting their character names correct, Komio and the Willendorf Braid.
Okay.
And because several pages into this, and again, we don't have page numbers, but at one point, once we're first introduced to these characters, and basically one of them, Komio, is this, I guess some kind of creature. She's he, it, whatever. It's I think the character's androgynous looking, although seems to be represented more like a female than a male. But even that is kind of sketchy. But it's a being who transforms and can easily make her, him, itself into whatever and whoever. And then the companion, the Willendorf braid, is basically a really long braid of hair that is bald toward the body and has legs and high heels.
Yeah. And bald, B-A-L-L-E-D, not B-A-L-D, right?
Right, yes. Yeah. So there is a wrapped braid that forms the top half of, I guess, the Willendorf braid's body, and then there's a long part of the braid that seems to be like the hair that comes out on top. But there's one page early on where we see these two characters, and it says Komio and the Willendorf braids best looks, and then we see a series of images of them. I mean, this is an interesting story, but I got the sense that Komio and the Willendorf braid are characters that Williams has worked with in the past. And I don't know if that's the case or not. I haven't looked up to see if there are other Komio and Willendorf braid stories. But I just got the feel that it felt that these are characters that he had worked with before. He's coming back to them, that this is another Komio and Willendorf braid story, which may not be the case. Did you sense that?
That's interesting because I was, when we were talking about Crawl Space being an experimental work that helps guide the reader into its world, I did feel like I felt like less firm ground with this book. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
And though the narrative about this kind of danger of gentrification and this larger kind of conspiracy that's going on as to why the gentrification is happening, does ultimately make sense at the end. I do wonder, how much, how accessible this might be otherwise. And in looking at some of his other books, I mean, one of the series that he's best known for is his Hungry Bottom comics. Mm-hmm. And there are, I've never read Hungry Bottom comics. There are images on his website that do show like a character with a long braid. And so it may very well be that we've seen, it does look like we've seen these. If you've read Hungry Bottom comics, you may be familiar with these characters. So, I guess it would have been helpful if there had been more of an introduction to the characters, or more of a sense of the fact that they were returning.
Right. Yeah. I wish I had seen, and I do want to see after this, those earlier issues of Hungry Bottom comics, because he, as it says in the book, it was nominated for a 2013 Doug Wright Spotlight Award. Mm-hmm.
The Canadian Comics Awards.
Right. So, basically what you and I are doing is similar to, I guess, the opposite of what we were doing with Keiler Roberts, right? We speculated what would it be like for a reader unfamiliar with Powdered Milk to pick up Sunburning. Now, this is the case with us and Williams's work, right? We've really, we did get that copy of Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit, but the characters apparently that he's working with here in Condo Heartbreak Disco are part of an ongoing storyline, I guess, or story world that he started with Hungry Bottom comics, which we're unfamiliar with. But it took me a while to understand that Komio can change the way that she does, but she's also kind of a free agent, right? So if people are wronged by certain individuals, then they can hire Komio and the Willendorf braid to wreak vengeance on them, right? And so Komio uses her transformative abilities in order to work her way into the person who's the target and then do whatever she needs to do.
Right.
And she can be ruthless.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's basically the world we have at the beginning of this story. Komio and Willendorf braid also room with, she's a writer. What's her name? Jean? Or Jean. And they live in this neighborhood that is being not just gentrified, but rapidly gentrified. I mean,
Right.
to the point that overnight people are being forced out of their apartments. And so that's where this story basically goes after that. One of the things that I found most interesting about this whole gentrification premise is how they actually how the powers that be, the builders, decide what they're going to do and how and why they're going to gentrify in the ways that they are. They get this information from, I guess, by tapping into the social media of a street artist who basically goes around, uses his smartphone to photograph people in the city. And these are usually people who, if not living on the street, then are just, common Joes and Josephines who are just getting by. And he's creating a series of photographs and posting them in a way that is his art. But the builders are seeing these and they say, okay, so what he's doing is creating this sense of urban life, and that's what we want to cash in on. And so if we can tap into – this is what people want. So if we can buy up all of these apartments and build new spaces, then we can charge more for what people are going to be drawn to. And this kind of consumer is, I think, epitomized by women who jog with their baby in a stroller, except their babies are cups of coffee. It's weird.
With giant mouths and yeah.
It's
surreal. Yeah. I think your summary there was way better than what I could do. I hope maybe one day that there will be, there might be a collected Komio and the Braid volume or something that might help give easier access to these characters and to this world. I felt like by the end of the story, I had pretty much figured out what was going on and what the major themes were and the relationships and so on. But it did take a while to get. It took longer to get my feet in a way that kind of was on the border of not paying off, if that makes sense. There was a point early on in this book that I did get frustrated with it because I just could not latch on to what was happening. And I was a bit disappointed because I did really like Baby Bell Wax Bodysuit. So, and I, was familiar enough with Williams's art style from that and his page layouts and so on, because he does do very strange and interesting things with page layouts. So I did feel like I knew how to read it in that sense. But I just felt like it took me too long to get on firm ground with what was happening and what the rules of this world are.
Yeah, I'm with you. I want to go back and fish out some of those early issues of Hungry Bottom Comics. And it would be nice to see a lot of these stories collected, and it would help to flesh out this narrative world because, you pointed out his art. I mean, I really do love what he does, and not just in terms of his illustration style, but as you mentioned, his page layouts.
Yeah.
Very inventive.
Yep.
Okay, moving on. We're turning now to Volcano Trash from Ben Sears. This is a follow-up to his book that came out a year ago, Night Air. And did you read Night Air when it came out?
No. Did Night Air include the same characters?
Yes. And in fact, that's where I first found out about Ben Sears. And, we're on Koyama's media review mailing list. And so one of the things that Ed Canerva, Annie Koyama mentions that, he's indispensable in in her work on the press.
Yeah.
And he's basically the publicity contact that we have. And every season he sends out not only a list of the books that are about to come out, but also a link to the PDFs that they have stored. And so whenever I get those, I tend to download all of those. Not that I look at these books immediately. And I have to say that Night Air was something that I thought looked interesting, but I didn't read at the time. And what caused me to actually take a look at it was Andy Wolverton said something about Night Air, and I can't remember if it was on a Young Readers episode that he did with Gwen, or if he just told me individually in an email. But I thought, I'll have to check that out. And then I saw that for this spring, his second book with Koyama Press, Volcano Trash, was coming out. And Volcano Trash it's a longer story than Night Air. Now, you can pick up Volcano Trash without even knowing that Night Air even existed, and you wouldn't miss anything, I think.
And that's what I did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that there were parts of this, I would guess, that you were scratching your head. I don't understand this relationship or this scenario. There are a few things that take place in Night Air that are alluded to briefly in Volcano Trash, but you wouldn't know it, and you don't need to know that. Now, another difference between Volcano Trash and Night Air, from what I can remember, is that with Night Air, I don't think that the names of the characters were ever made. Which is interesting. I'll have to go back and look just to confirm this. But in Volcano Trash, we learn that the protagonists are Plus Man and Hank.
Right.
And Plus Man is this young boy who wears goggles and a cap, and he's an adventurer. He often does things that get him in trouble. He's at times kind of a thief, but he's a thief who would only steal from those who were not nice.
Right. And he and Hank have a tendency. Hank's this robot that can transform into different
cool things,
different shapes and tools depending on what kind of disc that Plus Man can have for him. For example, Plus Man often brings the speedboat disc, even when it's completely impractical,
which is a software disc.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But they you're right that they're thieves, but they tend to target the bad guys. But they also have a tendency to blow a lot of things up when they probably shouldn't. And that's something that gets them into trouble in Volcano Trash.
Right. And so what basically we have going on here in Volcano Trash is that Plus Man and Hank are up against basically the authorities, the police in what is the community that they're in, or it's a Bolt City. Okay.
Yeah.
Now they at the beginning of the book they're up against another group, and this seems at first to be kind of a nefarious group of villains. But then later on we learn that Plus Man teams up with them, and so they're not all that bad because they're also being pressured by the police force of Bolt City. And so it's in this book, the police force, the authorities of Bolt City that are so corrupt that that's what Plus Man, Hank, and the rest that they team up with go up against. Now, fairly early on, Plus Man and Hank are on a heist, and against this, and I can't remember what the
labyrinth.
The labyrinth, right? And in fact, their hideout is a labyrinth that they can't find their way through, and they even make a comment about this. That's why they call it the labyrinth. And so they make their way out, but then they are captured by the Bolt City police. Plus Man is released because of some things that Hank says. Basically, Hank says, his robot says, I'm the one who's responsible. He is innocent. I was misleading him. You want me, not Plus Man. And so they release Plus Man, but Hank remains in jail. And Plus Man says, I've got to get Hank out of jail. And so one of the people who works with Plus Man and Hank is a friend of theirs named Basil. And he's the wingman, right? He's the guy who drives the getaway vehicle whenever they need it. And so Plus Man basically, instead of losing himself in drink once he gets out of jail because he's depressed that his robot Hank, his friend, is there, he loses himself in sugary drinks.
Right.
And video games. So, Basil comes to the bar, quote unquote, that he's in and says, hey, you got to snap out of it. You got to do something. You got to respect yourself, man. And that's the best way of helping Hank.
Right. Yeah. So this is I think at first it may feel like this book is really loosely structured because we go from this labyrinth heist to these other events, but it's tied together by, it ties together in the end anyway, but it's also tied together by this theme of friendship and what Plus Man has to do first what sacrifice Hank makes for Plus Man, and then what Plus Man has to do in order to save Hank.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so at its heart, this book has a real, a real sweetness to it that I really appreciated. Like of the stuff we read, I think this was my favorite.
Oh, really?
I really liked, pretty much everything. I thought, You a Bike and Road was maybe one of the most accomplished works here, along with Keiler Roberts's. But this book, I'm glad to know that there's another book with these characters in it, because this was the one I really wanted to read more of.
Yeah. We should mention that if you want to find out even more about Ben Sears' Volcano Trash, then keep listening into the month, because Gwen and Paul are going to be discussing Volcano Trash as one of the books that for their young readers.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And that's the kind of work that Ben Sears does. I do feel that it is an all-age story. I wouldn't necessarily call it one just for younger readers, because as you were pointing out, there's something that mature readers, grown-ups can really appreciate it. I mean, it's quite sophisticated, but this is definitely something that a younger reader could pick up and not only enjoy but identify with, right? Because some of the characters, the way that Plus Man acts, or the behavior of his robot Hank, there's a lot there. And also there's a lot of humor that I think kids would love and adults would love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I thought this book has a lot of, again, universal appeal, and it's just fun. And part of the fun is the characters, the relationship between Plus Man and Hank, but also, that the fact that Plus Man's a hero, but he's a hero who doesn't always make great decisions.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that about him. He's really endearing in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are just a variety of occasions in this book where you could just, almost at random pick a page where Plus Man is talking with someone, whether it be Hank or Basil or one of the other characters that appears in this book. And, you get to see his personality, which is quite humorous and childlike, sweet. And I think is a good word that you used. And this is an example of a book that I think Koyama tends to do really well. And I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that they don't get as much recognition of the comics that they do for younger readers, or that could possibly be for younger readers. I mean, I think that both of the Ben Sears books that have come out over the past year from Koyama are good examples of this. Maybe even better so than last fall, one book that they released was John Martz's Bert's Way Home. And that was a really nice book. But I think Bert's Way, I don't know if you saw that one, but that's definitely for a younger reader. Whereas this one is one that a younger reader could appreciate, but there's a lot more going on. In other ways, Bert's Way Home reminded me of something more like say a picture book than or a children's book that, let's say, the Ben Sears books. But so whereas I probably wouldn't give a kid Condo Heartbreak Disco to read, I would definitely have no qualms giving them Volcano Trash.
Right.
And then enjoying it myself.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I definitely want to check out more of this. I really love the world that Sears creates here, but also keeping at its heart this friendship between Plus Man and Hank, which is so endearing.
Right, and this is, you were talking about Ben Sears' story world. This is something that he could take in a variety of different directions for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, it strikes me, okay, I don't want to suggest that Koyama couldn't really take this and really do something with it in ways that are exciting, that gets Sears a lot of attention. They are a smaller publisher, but this strikes me as the kind of property that a publisher like, let's say, First Second would grab onto, or maybe Abrams with their Amulet imprint, and create just a series, one right after another, of these adventures. But I do hope that Sears stays with Koyama and they continue to come out with these books.
Yes. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more of this and tracking down Night Air as well.
Okay, so we come to the very last book that we're going to be discussing on the Koyama Spring 2017 Spotlight, and this is So Pretty, Very Rotten, and that's So Pretty / Very Rotten. The subtitle is Comics and Essays on Lolita Fashion and Cute Culture, and this is written and drawn by Jane Mai and Anne Nguyen. Now, I wasn't familiar before this with Nguyen's writings or her work, but I am a little familiar with Jane Mai's comics. Had you read any of their stuff before individually?
No, I was trying to remember. Have they worked for Koyama before?
I think that Mai has published 2 books with Koyama, Sunday in the Park with Boys and then See You Next Tuesday.
Yeah, I've read See You Next Tuesday, and I really like that.
Okay, yeah, that's one that I want to read, but I haven't yet. My first exposure to Jane Mai was a book of hers that came out a couple of years ago from Piao Studios, Soft. And the reason why I found out about it was because it was nominated for an Ignatz in 2015. And so in preparing for that episode that Andy Wolverton and I did, where we looked at the Ignatz nominees, I got a copy of Soft, and I really liked it. So this is the only other thing of hers that I've read, but I do have to check out those other ones that you mentioned.
Yeah. Now, one of the other things I was trying to remember, and I don't have it handy, but I feel like in a past batch of Koyama books, we got another book about that was kind of a hybrid comic and instruction book about anime that had an anime tone to it. That was also about that was also about cosplay though.
Not so much about cosplay. I think I know what you're referring to, and this is something that Shay and I discussed on one of our manga episodes last year. And this is, and I'm going to butcher her name as I always do. This is her pen name, Roku Denashiko, which is Japanese for good for nothing girl. What is Obscenity? The story of a good for nothing artist and her pussy.
Yeah, that is not the book I was thinking of.
Oh, okay. Because, in my conversation with Annie Koyama, because I was asking her about her experience with manga, and she said that this and What is Obscenity are basically the only things that she's done with manga, because I thought maybe that she had released more. But did you read What is Obscenity?
No.
Okay. It was mostly comics. It had some essay in it, but it definitely wasn't about cosplay. Mm-hmm. It was about an artist and her pussy, basically. As the title, What Does Obscenity Suggests.
Mm-hmm. No, I remember getting that. I may be thinking of then something from a different publisher that wasn't Koyama, because I'm not seeing it on their website either. Oh, it might be, actually, I think it might be One Piece Books, now that I think about it. So that, scratch that. But we have gotten another book gotten books before that were about about fashion and relationship to manga and anime.
Right. Now, as we were mentioning, this is a hybrid text, and as the subtitle suggests, it is made up of both comics and essays. And for the most part, Nguyen is the one who writes the essay, although there is one significant piece by Jane Mai where she writes about her experience with Lolita fashion. But there are also, and Mai does most of the comics, but there are quite a number that Nguyen does as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's not as if one is the writer and one is the artist. Both pull double duty, which I really appreciate. Now, Andy, let me ask you, before this book, what was your knowledge of Lolita fashion?
I had none. I had no idea that it even existed.
Okay. And the reason why I ask is not just in light of this book, So Pretty, Very Rotten, because of my own experiences. There was maybe a year and a half ago an occasion where Amanda, my wife, and Zoe and I were eating dinner one night, and toward the end of the meal, somehow Zoe brought up Lolita culture or Lolita dress. And I hadn't really heard of it, and Amanda hadn't heard of it. And so we were asking Zoe about it, and she had a sense of it, but I don't think she could tell us what it was. And so we had a sketchy idea. But Amanda heard Lolita, and of course she immediately thought of Nabokov.
Right.
And of course there's a Kubrick film version of that. And she thought that there was something nefarious going on. And so Zoe was expressing an interest in that kind of fashion, and Amanda became a little stern. She said, I don't think that that's anything that you should really get into. And I think she thought that it was a kind of fashion that made young girls into looking desirable to older men, which, through the eyes of Humbert Humbert in Nabokov's famous novel, he saw a younger woman trying to look older in order to appeal to him as an adult male.
Right.
That's definitely not what Lolita fashion is all about. And I think one of the most useful pieces in this book is the chapter that Nguyen writes, frequently asked questions about Lolita fashion, and she specifically addresses this issue. She says, in no way whatsoever does it have any connection to Vladimir Nabokov or the Stanley Kubrick film. And in fact, it's the opposite. It's not younger girls dressing older to be more desirable to older men. It's both younger and older women who want to retain this sense of almost cuteness and innocence that is completely divorced from sexuality or desirability to the opposite sex. And she's very clear about that. And she does explain Lolita fashion in a way that I wish I had this book in front of me during that conversation at dinner about a year and a half ago. But, because then I could say, oh, this is what you're referring to. And of course, there's also the art that gives us clear examples of what Lolita fashion looks like, or what it could look like. And so I think this is an interesting book. It's not only a series of stories, and so it's not only fascinating on a narrative level, but I think much more so on a sociological level, because what both Nguyen and Mai do is they get into what this culture is all about, some of its history, but not all of it, because, I mean, there's no clear understanding. No one seems to know exactly where the word Lolita comes from. You know, if it's not connected to Nabokov, then where does it come from? It just strikes me that there has to be some connection, even tenuous in some way, to Nabokov. Otherwise, why the Lolita designation? I don't know. But, I mean, there is as full a history as they can give of it. There's some interviews here. I really did enjoy both the piece by and the interview with, oh God, what is the fashion designer who helped to popularize that look? And I'm blanking here.
Is it Takamoto?
Yes. Because there's a piece by him, and then there is an interview with him. And he has done probably from this book, what it says, more than anyone to help popularize this look, this fashion. And he has some specific thoughts on this. And so many of these ideas that are brought up in the various essays and interviews are given narrative life in the comic stories of both Mai and Nguyen. And so I think the essays and comics work really well in combination. Yeah,
I would agree on that. I'd kind of going back to the conversation that you had with your wife and daughter about this. I think that, and you asking me, was I familiar with it? I think it points to the relative isolation I am in a smaller South Carolina community where this stuff hasn't gotten here yet. And it may be a few years, if at all, that I ever see it.
Yeah. And again, according to what these guys write about in the book, I mean, this is a fashion trend, at least in Japan, that has already reached its peak. But apparently, a few years ago here in Texas, there were a lot of people of high school age who were discussing this and definitely knew about it.
Yeah, but I think that's, you're in a more cosmopolitan area than I am.
So maybe eventually you'll see some of the residue of Lolita fashion.
And I will know what it is.
Yes. Now, I found it interesting, the title of this book, So Pretty / Very Rotten. Now, the So Pretty, I definitely understand. I'm not sure how Mai and Nguyen are using Very Rotten. I would think that Very Rotten would have more negative connotations, but I could even see potentially positive connotations. Someone is so sweet that they, ripen and rot. But there are a couple of pieces in this book where I think we see the potential downside of Lolita culture, Lolita fashion. And both of these come from Jane Mai. There is about 2/3 of the way through the essay by Mai. It's the only one that she writes in here, called Good at Looking Good. And she tells us about her own experiences with this when she was younger, how she discovered Lolita and how she became almost obsessed with it. But then she saw that was causing her some problems, and she weaned herself from that. And then immediately following that is one of Mai's comic stories called Empty, and it's about someone like she just described herself in that previous essay, someone who is really not a participant in Lolita culture, but who comes to love it and in essence comes to lose herself in it by the end of the story, literally. And I think that's what the Empty refers to here. And to me, those are the only pieces in this book, and it's long. This goes on for almost a little over 300 pages. The only potential downside to Lolita fashion, Lolita culture, are those two pieces by Jane Mai. Maybe that's what the Very Rotten could potentially refer to. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Wow. A lot of titles we discussed. These are all 6 that are the spring releases from Koyama Press. We started off with You and a Bike and a Road by Eleanor Davis. After that, we looked at Keiler Roberts' new book, Sunburning. Then at Jesse Jacobs' Crawl Space, Condo Heartbreak Disco by Eric Kostiuk Williams. Then Ben Sears' new book, Volcano Trash. Then we wrapped up with Jane Mai and Anne Gwen's So Pretty, Very Rotten.
Mm-hmm.
I really do like Koyama Press.
Yes, they do great stuff, and I'm glad that they send us their stuff.
Yes, so they're definitely a publisher to check out. And even though you can't find any Koyama books there right now, another place to find great comics is the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a whole slew of discounts every single month. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our spotlight on Koyama and their spring 2017 releases. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. You can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com, and you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And you can also check our Twitter feed, which is at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
Check us on other places in social media, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of the podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us, let us know how we're doing and find out what we're doing.
And we do like to hear from you, whether it's from Twitter or email or Facebook, whatever means. Just get in touch with us and let us know that you appreciate what we're doing, or that you don't. I mean, you could yell at us and curse us. That'd be fine.
That's true, too.
That's right. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.